9:30 now.
The Radio Wammo Breakfast.
Live from the New Scientist Labs, Janine Young, newscientist.com.
Joining us in Melbourne City, Janine Young is back. Hello to you, Janine.
Good morning.
We're slightly stuffed up there, so you don't sound too well this morning, but thanks for joining us.
That's fine. My commitment to the cause is strong.
Good. Well, we'll try not to keep you too long, but there's a couple of interesting stories. First up, and I've always wondered what happened to those years before school. I mean, I'm sure they happened, but they're not there in my memory, Janine. Where did they go?
They certainly existed. It's not like you came out fully formed. I'm sure your mother would agree that, there were a number of years before you went to school, but a lot of stuff happened and you're not going to remember it. Frankly, neither do I. In fact, 99% of the population isn't going to remember the very early stuff that happened in their lives.
Yeah.
Now, there's a number of reasons for this. Now, first of all, your brain is developing. And so you've got a whole bunch of connections that need to be made that when you're really, really young aren't there. So, you can't put memories into long-term storage if they're just not there in the first place. Now, they've known for a long time that the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are two of the really important parts of your brain for laying down long-term memory. And in particular, these autobiographical memories. So remembering what happened to you at any given time, last week or last year or 10 years ago. But when you're really young, there's a certain part of the hippocampus that just isn't developed, and it doesn't mature until you're about 4 or 5 years of age. So that means that a bunch of those memories are not going to get laid down into long-term storage simply because the brain isn't capable of doing it. That's not all there is to it, because you've got other different ways of building your experience and the way your brain is developing. It's really interesting that the average age for a European child to remember its first memory, and indeed I asked my other half about this last night, well, what do you remember? And he went, he couldn't even think about his earliest memory. The average age, and he's from Scotland, is 3.5. So he was fairly clear about that, and he can't remember anything. But then again, he can't remember people's names, so that's probably different. I can remember about 4.
Yeah.
3.5, 4. I remember a kid down the street biting me. But that's probably because it was a reasonably traumatic event. And so it's been laid down in my memory, but I think I was about 3.5. So that's fairly common for my sort of type of cultural upbringing.
It's funny. Normally it would have to be something that's a big deal at the time, and I think one of my earlier ones was finding cat poo in the sandpit.
Ah!
And I just hated it, as you do. And that's what I remember.
That's probably fair, and that's something that stays with you for life, and rightly so. Pardon me. Interestingly, East Asian children have an average age of 4.8 when they remember their first memories. So that's more than a year later than, say, Europeans or Northern American children. Whereas Maori children, on the other hand, have an average age of 2.7 years when they have their first memory. And this has been one of those things that researchers have been really interested in quite why, because it's not just brain anatomy that can explain that kind of thing. They know that the sense of self, so the ability to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and go, that's me. And in my case, I can say, I don't look very good today. That sense of self, being able to work out who you are, needs to develop before you can help to organise your memories. It's a really interesting process, but again, it ties in with brain anatomy, it ties in with child development. There's a lot going on.
I wonder how that relates to animals, because when you think about it, like cats, you show a cat a mirror, and more often than not, they won't acknowledge their presence there.
No, they don't get it, whereas dolphins and elephants, on the other hand, do have this sense of self. They can actually look at themselves and go, yep, that's me. Now, how you test this, completely different story. But I think that, just as an aside, animal memory is likely to be less conscious than the way we do it, and it's more reactive. Their memories are all about where food is and the like, as opposed to these autobiographical, last week I had some really good chocolate brownies and they made me feel good. it's not quite the same style of memory. It's
Yeah.
not as important. Anyway, the development of language is really, really important because they think that the contents of your first memories depend on your first words. Researchers have shown that if you go back to a situation where toddlers are shown, for example, a lion that's resting, for want of a better term, you put a lion in a drawer, a stuffed toy, not the real thing, otherwise they really would remember it. And then you come back to them a little while later. The words that they use to describe that situation are only the words that they had at the time. So even though a year later their language has boomed, their vocabulary just explodes, they will only use words that they had at the time of that experiment. So it's really important because they think that you're able to work out what your memories are based on the words at the time, but tied in with that is the ability to tell stories, narrative, something that we do every day. I'm doing it now. Narrative is telling a story. And I think that it's really important about how your parents and other adults talk to you when you're a child. Northern European and North American, Australian cultures and the like tend to be very big on elaboration as opposed to repetition. They're the two factors in this. So I remember my mother telling me stories about my nana, her mother, making biscuits with me when I was only 3 or 4. She died when I was 4, so there's only so much I can remember.
Yeah.
But I now have a memory of it that I've probably concocted. But it was all about, how excited Nana was, and we'd have lots of chocolate-type biscuits, and I have a very clear description of what happened. Whereas, say, in an East Asian culture, the past is all about learning how to make the future better. And the child's role in it and their feelings are just not as important as they are in, say, our culture. What's really interesting is that in Maori culture, they're much bigger on storytelling, even more than us.
Yeah.
They're much more interested in the past, and it's all about detailed histories. It's all about this elaboration, and that might be a very clear indicator as to why their children tend to have memories much, much earlier than any other culture that they've studied. So it's all about this elaboration, storytelling, all about the past, how the child ties into it, their role for the future and how it ties to the past and the like. So it's fascinating that you've got all these things going on, and without realising, this is changing how much we remember and from what age.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. That is really interesting. Now, before we go, Janine, can you give us a quick update on the Gulf oil spill, because it's been a year since that terrible disaster happened?
It has. It's extraordinary how fast it's gone. I'd like to be able to say that we're able to quantify a lot of the effects that have gone on around the Gulf, and that we know how badly sea creatures are being damaged and the like, but we can't. They just don't have any handle at the moment on how badly the Gulf has been damaged.
Why?
They do know that there's, and I'm going to read this to get this right, toxic polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So they're going to be oil-based nasties, basically, in the sediment in the Gulf, but they are still trying to confirm that it's come from the Deepwater Horizon. They haven't been able to work too much else out. Unfortunately, the money that BP was putting up, and it was $500 million for research to try and work out what's gone on, they've only just become available. The grants are only just up for grabs, whereas, BP has also said they'll put $1 billion up for remediation efforts. But they just don't know at the moment just how bad it's been, unfortunately.
So the nasty old BP's stalling the process by the sounds of it.
Well, it's also difficult for researchers because to be able to have had snapshots beforehand to compare with after is very tricky as well, because a few people were monitoring the Gulf beforehand, but I don't think they ever anticipated that there would be a disaster on such a scale that they would need this baseline data to then be able to make comparisons. So in some respects, researchers are working without baseline because some of them don't have that information.
Well, those stories you'll find in the New Scientist magazine coming out next week, and also online as well, newscientist.com. Janine, go get yourself better, perhaps a cup of tea and a lie down, and we'll see you next week.
Talk to you next week.